So good evening and good morning and good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. It's good evening for me, so I'm just going to start with good evening. Today we have a panel discussion as part of the virtual summit on resilient and regenerative food systems. And the theme for today's discussion is just transition in the food sector. So we have four great speakers. Dr. Vintura Silva, Mr. Duncan Williams, Mr. Happy Khambule, and Ms. Tina Johnson, who are joining us. Welcome, and I will pass the mic to them to make the introduction to what they do and how it connects to the work that we are going to talk about today. So I'll start with Dr. Vintura Silva, and then I'll pass the mic to the others. Vintura, would you like to go first and introduce the work that you do, what you're doing, where you're working?
Thanks, Vositha. Greetings from Grenada to everyone who's attending. It's been a pleasure to be invited and speaking on this topic of just transition. I work with the UNFCCC, UN Climate Change Office. We're headquarters in Bonn, but I head the regional office for the Caribbean, and I'm based here in Grenada. Of course, here we work a lot with the implementation of climate policies, supporting governments, working with other partner organizations. But also a part of my work had been supporting the work of response measures in the negotiation process, where the topic of just transition is discussed within the UN negotiations. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Vintura. Could I ask Happy to go next, and then Duncan, and then Tina? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hi, my name is Happy Khambule, and I am from South Africa. I work for an organization called Mansa Advisory. I'm going to be talking about the South African context with regards to the just transition in agriculture, more likely touching mostly on the issues that pertain to the development of the programs that are now there and what led up to that. And thank you for the opportunity, and I'll hand over to Duncan.
Thank you very much, Happy. Thank you. Yes, I'm Duncan Williamson. I'm the founder and director of Nourishing Food Systems and a founder at Eating Better. And we advise on food systems and sustainable agriculture, working with organisations like Chatham House, Nourish Scotland, IPES Food. Prior to that, I headed up the food systems work at Compassion World Farming and WWF. And I'm going to be talking about, just transitions in relation to food and agriculture, and a program that's looking at getting the voice of farmers heard at COP26 next year. Thank you.
Great. Hi, I'm Tina Johnson, and I work with in the context of policy and advocacy in both the international and the national fora. I'm from the US, and I have a particular interest in my work around equity and justice within the context of the framework of environmental justice. So I'm the principal of Johnson Strategy and Development, and currently the director of the National Black Environmental Justice Network. And I will be digging in today on just transition through an equity and justice lens, and looking at agriculture as it pertains to women. So happy to be here and look forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Let's go to the first presentation, which is by Dr. Vintura Silva. And I guess you'll be sharing your screen. Let's just try it. Yes, thank you, everyone.
Vositha, can you confirm that you could see my screen?
Yes, can see it clearly.
Okay. Thank you. And again, to provide some brief background on just transition and climate change. As I said, I work for the Climate Change Secretariat, and this is a topic of interest, so just to understand why. Well, the decent work, poverty eradication, and environmental sustainability are three of the defining challenges of the 21st century. The the number of unemployed people rose from 170 million in 2007 to 188 million at the end of 2019. As you know, things have changed a lot since then with the COVID pandemic. You'll see like 4 of the sectors that were impacted highly from the COVID outbreak were food and accommodation, with manufacturing actually being the highest sector that was impacted. And this number of unemployment could easily double according to the ILO calculations from the COVID impact this year. So we do not know the final numbers yet, but it is going to be a drastic change from unemployment figures that we've seen in 2018. And this is going to be a challenge. It's not just about the employment or not, but also the quality and the working conditions, which also pose additional challenges. So there, sorry, I was going to ask for the next slide. But it's also another interesting fact is that it was estimated that actually climate change, along with the technology change, would be the biggest drivers of employment into the 21st century. And hence it was important to look at how climate change is impacting on the job market. You would have heard of another important declaration that came into being in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development also highlights the inclusive and sustainable economic growth and employment, as well as decent work for all, as one of its key foundations. Now, the goal for sustainable development under the Sustainable Development Goals, the goal number 8, which talks about employment, talks about the need to create 600 million jobs by 2030, which reflects into 40 million jobs to be created annually. But it's not also just about creation of jobs. It's not about the numbers, but also the improvement of the quality of the employment that matters. It's emphasized that uncontrolled climate change could not only compromise the ability to meet this goal, but also could reverse the gains that was in the economic prosperity, social progress, and also poverty reduction, which could indirectly impact again the number of jobs that will be created and the quality of jobs. So sectors particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts, and agriculture are amongst the biggest employers, and hence another reason why climate change will impact on the creation of jobs and also achievement of the goal number 8 if climate change issues are not addressed. And hence it is important that we discuss this topic in depth within the climate change negotiations, because it's going to be something that's contributing to the sustainable development of countries and the general well-being of its populace. I mentioned a reference to decent work and quality jobs when I mentioned the SDG goal 8. What it means when you say decent and quality jobs, it means productive and delivers a fair income for the workers, security in the workplace for the workers, social protection for the families of the employees, better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom of expression, organization and participation in decision making that affects their livelihood, and equal opportunity that includes the gender equality in work. So there's these various aspects that need to be addressed when we are saying we are creating decent and quality jobs. It's not just saying the numbers that impacts. Now, when we come to just transition within the climate change, it means we only don't talk about actually it in the context of adaptation, but also in context of mitigation. In a global transition for low carbon economy, that's reducing the carbon footprint, and developing a climate resilient adaptive economy, which we call in general climate compatible development. It needs to be entrusted that the employment affected and the dynamics are well understood, and the policy areas and the institutional arrangement that need to be identified to address the issues related to the well-being of the affected workers are put in place, and this sufficiently address the concerns of the affected employees. So it's about creation of jobs, but also about decent jobs, taking into account understanding what are the various dynamics that's involved, and also considering the well-being. So it's both a mitigation and as well as an adaptation topic, whether it's in addressing the adverse impacts of climate change or adapting and to climate change. We both need to consider that the employees who would be affected and the work that would be affected would be sufficiently addressed. How we address this, we usually look at a framework where we look at the impact from these actions, what we call climate actions, on the environment, the social impacts and the economic impacts. So in the case of environment, when it is talking about mitigation, it's about generally reducing the greenhouse gases, which in effect lead to reduction of global warming and climate change. And when it talks about adaptation, it's about vulnerability and risk reductions. Along with this, as I mentioned, there will be job creation or job losses depending on the action that you take. So when the parameters you would be tracking on these would be the numbers of jobs that would be created or lost, and so on the economic, the impact on the GDP, and that would be quantified in dollar figures. So we look at many socio-economic and environmental parameters in order to understand better the impacts of a policy that a country is taking and take sufficient actions in order to address these impacts. And when you talk about the quantitative impacts of jobs, it could be a job creation. New jobs could be created in new areas. In the food sector, it could be with the smart agriculture, new farming methodologies, the changes in procedures. Maybe if you look at the agriculture sector, you could be changing the way you grow crops and maybe the type of crops, and that would need or the type of agriculture that you are involved in could be from a transition from fisheries, but because of the climate conditions, you might need to transit into a different type of crop growing, which would need a change in the skills and knowledge that's needed. It could be job substitutions. Some jobs could be eliminated totally. For example, the work that was in some of the traditional agriculture sectors. Job transformation and redefinition. So some of the work could be transformed into new work areas, and it could be redefined within the same sector. And what would be like some of these opportunities in light of Paris Agreement? When you look at the impacts, you could see some new jobs created in smart agriculture, more resilient agriculture technologies for not just directly in the farming, but in the research areas, research and development around it. Also the support framework in the agriculture sector, in training the farmers. There could be new jobs that are created in the transition for smart and climate resilient agriculture, or food processing could be different depending on the new crops that are growing. As you know, there's a huge impact on agriculture that is estimated with the tropics becoming increasingly warmer, and also some of the extreme northern and southern areas where they are currently growing wine. There is a possibility for the climate to change that would impact the cultivars that they are growing, that could change from the whole industry as it is. And in these cases, there would be some of the jobs that would be needed for creation of new jobs according to the cultivars that could be growing. Then social justice and poverty eradication, new investments in industries, infrastructure linked with these changes, cleaner technologies and industrial processes. These are mostly linked with, of course, the cleaner technologies, the renewable energies that would be involved. Then if you look at some of the challenges, there could be also job losses in other sectors, the traditional farming, as mentioned, absence of appropriate government policies, funds, and structures could hamper, especially in the developing countries, this transition. Lack of formal social dialogue and mechanisms, so lack of understanding of the needs of the various actors and the dynamics involved, how these actions are interlinked. The insufficient support for retraining, reskilling, so sometimes we don't know what are the other technologies, what are the training that's needed. And also addressing the needs of the vulnerable workers who will be impacted, and also from the social inclusiveness impact, the communities that would be of lower, the lower economic, socioeconomic classes, how they will be impacted and how those to be addressed. So these are some of the challenges that are faced in light of implementation of the Paris Agreement. And Paris Agreement itself directly recognizes this within the agreement itself. It states taking into account the imperatives of a just transition of workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with the nationally defined development priorities. And how is just transition actually discussed within the negotiations? So it's okay to have it within the Paris Agreement. It's also sufficiently addressing the convention about the need for just transition and recognition of the impacts on jobs from the climate actions. How are we going to address it? It's mainly on the technical level. Actually, as I said, it's a mitigation as well as adaptation issue. Within the mitigation, it's actually discussed within the forum for response measures. The topic of response measures is talking about the impacts of the mitigation actions on socioeconomic impacts, either within the jurisdiction where it is implemented, that is the country maybe in some cases, or within some national level where the policies are implemented for mitigation or adaptation, but also talking about extra jurisdiction or out of jurisdiction, which talks about across the borders from where the actions are implemented. So response measures talks about this discussion of mitigation actions, but also adaptation. We talk about the impact, the socioeconomic impact of the adaptation activities that would impact the jobs and how to address these. You could see the timelines on how this topic had evolved within the negotiation process. So currently we have what we call the Response Measures Forum, which discusses economic diversification and just transition as two of the elements in addressing some of these impacts from the mitigation actions and how to address these concerns. And there's a technical committee which was established in Katowice, the KCI or Katowice Committee, that looks at the impact of the implementation of mitigation actions on social and economic fronts. And this committee is a technical committee that would support the Response Measures Forum in identifying the latest research that's being done, and it's also created to enhance cooperation among the parties, stakeholders, external organizations to further develop the knowledge around this topic in order to support the countries address some of the concerns, enhance capacity through creating awareness, direct technical knowledge on the tools, and also to promote action through providing information from this forum. Another important change that took place in Katowice was the Just Transition Declaration. This again was focused more on the topic of mitigation and the impact on the job market. This was significant in Katowice, which was a coal city, and many people who were in the coal industry would be impacted through transition to renewable and more cleaner energy. and hence it was significant for the Polish government. And with the COP having been in Katowice, that there was a solidarity and just transition Silesia declaration, which was signed by many of the government leaders in Katowice. Some of the outputs from the response measures committee was, one of them was this technical paper on just transition, which you could look into. It's available, and see, these are some of the topics that was discussed within one of the in-forum workshops that was held in 2013 on the topic of just transition, which talks about the reskilling, the training, the green enterprises, the labor policies, the social protection, talking about appropriate public policies that need to be addressed, stakeholders to develop mechanisms for just transition. So it's not just left to the government, but also the private sector, the NGOs and the other multilateral development partners, ensuring that this process is country-driven, so understanding and meeting the needs of individual countries, and design and implement phases, in phases in order to identify possible consequences on employment and economic growth. So some of the measures like economic diversification itself could have impact on the job market that are taken to address some of the negative impacts of socioeconomic impacts of mitigation or adaptation. And it's to ensure that all these dynamics and the interlinked relationships are considered. And here we look at some of the key policies that need to be looked at national level from the ILO about the industrial and sectoral policies, enterprise policies, skill development policies, occupational health and safety, and various other linked policies that need to be looked into while considering a just transition measure within the country. As I said, it's not just with climate change, with the COVID-19, there is a new paradigm where we need to talk, we are talking about a green recovery from COVID-19, where we need to look at not just the resilience to health problems, of course, mainly the COVID, addressing the COVID issue, but also ensuring that we achieve the climate goals and also consider the growth and employment opportunities within this, as well as addressing any negative impacts to ensure that the labor force have, who will be impacted would have never jobs that are of quality and what we call a decent employment. Thank you for listening. So this was my attempt to bring together some of the developments within the UNFCCC framework and the topic of just transition and how it's impacting both adaptation and mitigation policies, and what it is important to consider while taking actions to address one issue, whether it's the health issue, the COVID-19, or climate change issues, that it's important to keep an eye on how it's impacting the growth and employment scenario as well. Back to you, Vositha.
Thank you, Vintura. That was a very informative presentation. We got an overview of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and all things that connect with response measures and just transition. I think we'll get elaborations of these elements in the next presentation. So Duncan, I'll pass the mic to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's going to be very hard to follow the previous one. It was really, really good, very interesting. I've learned a lot. So yeah, so I'm going to be talking to you about just transition and the food system, so food, agriculture, climate change. And so I'm going to sort of go over sort of where we are now and where we need to go, looking towards COP26 especially, and the role of just transition in that. So first of all, as we know, the food system is sort of in the middle of a vicious circle where it is responsible for many of the biggest problems we're seeing in the world, wherever you are. It's a driver behind climate change. It's also a driver behind the lack of diversity within our food system, which makes it vulnerable. There's a lack of crop diversity, livestock diversity, which means if climate change gets worse, they're vulnerable to the changes in climate because they're not adaptable to local systems. It's the food system's also a big driver behind many of the key environmental impacts in the world at the moment. So biodiversity loss, I think 60% of global biodiversity loss is attributed to the food system, deforestation, air pollution, water pollution, the amount of water used, soil erosion, the list goes on. And the challenge for the food system is not only is it causing these problems, but these problems make it even more vulnerable to become secure in the future. There's also social and health impacts. We're seeing gender inequality, people in the lowest parts of economic areas of society are getting less money. They're in food poverty, they're food insecure. We have global malnutrition pandemic, where we know that sort of about half the global population is malnourished, whether it's from hunger, hidden hunger, or being overweight and obesity. And then to top it all off, the food system is responsible for massive cultural losses, where we are having, because we're having such an homogenous food system and homogenous food choices, we're all starting to eat exactly the same, and all of those and the problem with that is we're losing our culture, our traditions. It's impacting on our family life, and also again we're relying on a very vulnerable system to provide us with food, so it's impacting on every element of our life. And this has all been built on a food system that is based on intensive and industrial agriculture, with an approach to food where it's not about variety, it's not about nutrition, it's not about history, it's just about calories, putting more and more calories in and hang the consequences and what that means for people. And we know that's just not working. We know we need to move to a different system. The FAO has talked about this, the UNEP has talked about it, many NGOs and other organizations have talked about we need to do a just transition for food. It's going to be key for us to meet the SDGs we've just heard about and our climate goals, but it's also important to make sure that this transition benefits farmers. It brings people with them. It brings the poorest of society, people in urban areas and rural areas, and it must be underpinned by not just agroecology, which makes perfect sense, but also looking at the consumption, the diet side of it. So for people in, say, countries where I'm living, like England, we need to eat a lot less meat, and eat better quality meat, not rely on massively industrially produced chicken, for example. So we need to look at what we're eating as well as our level. But the good news is we do know what a lot of these solutions are, and the whole ecological solutions are really exciting. They're great opportunities because the solutions are all about diversity. It means different solutions for different places, for different people. It's about it's as simple as the alphabet: A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. It's about agricultural diversity, biological diversity, cultural diversity, dietary diversity, environmental diversity, financial diversity, and gender diversity. We need diversity is core to a sustainable food system. It's core to the resilience of any food system, and it's going to be core to tackling climate change. So we need to look at diversity. And the wonderful thing about the diversity is we do have most of the solutions already. We've just moved away from them as we've gone into a more industrial system. We just need to start moving back towards them. And how can we support a transition towards these solutions is what we need to look at. And when it comes to the principles of just transition in agriculture, ActionAid produced a report at the end of last year, which summed them up, I think, very, very well. That sort of when we're looking at just transitions, we have to look at the inequalities. We really need to tackle all the inequalities in the food system, whether it's rich, poor, middle class, lower class, upper class, whichever countries it is. I mean, we've seen with COVID that inequalities have got exacerbated in every country. In the United Kingdom, we now have 1.5 million children in food poverty, which has risen by almost 1 million in this year alone. So inequalities are getting worse and worse everywhere. We've also got to transition to a food system that works for everyone. It's a food system that works for nature, it works for climate, it works for health, and it works for people. And that is so important in this. It's a food system we can do, but it's a transformation that needs to happen. And it's a transformation that I really believe is a bottom-up transformation that will be led by people, that will be led by farmers, because I feel that it is not, the opportunity for others to lead has not been grasped as quickly as it could. It has to be inclusive. We have to have everyone participating in it, and then you have to develop a comprehensive framework, which will be a different framework for different areas, for different people, for different societies, but it needs to be a really strong framework that we can look at to build up the solutions for this. And we're thinking about that in moving towards COP26 in Glasgow, and be aware that next year is a super year for food. Sorry. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Food Systems Summit, the Global Nutrition Summit, and the Climate Change Summit. So we're looking at what we're calling next year being a super year to deliver the goals we need for a sustainable food system, to deliver the start of a just transition. So there's a process going on which is being led by a farming organisation in Scotland called Nourish Scotland, supported by WWF, IPES Food. It's got the Global Alliance for the Future of Food on board, and a whole host of others. A few UN agencies are contributing to it. I will look at us supporting it. It's called the Glasgow Process, which has two parts. One is a Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration, and this is to get farming bodies and the subnational governments together to commit to tackle the climate emergency through integrated food policies, and calling for governments to act, calling for the COP to put food and farming as a key solution to the climate emergency. I've been to many COPs, and even last year at Madrid, food and farming was on the margins. It was more side events where people were talking about it. It was almost completely ignored at the main event. And the Glasgow Declaration is going to try and build to change that. It's building on the Milan Protocol, building on the work from the C40 cities, building on other things that have been happening over the last few years to try and get food, farming, and just transition into COP, so it stays there for the next 10 years as we start coming up with solutions, because these solutions must benefit as many people as possible, and so we have to take people with us. The other side to that is what we're calling the fork to farm dialogues. These are a set of conversations which are based around local regional groups of food producers. They can be big or small. They can be organic, they can be intensive. You can have 1,000 acres or you can have 4 acres. The dialogues can have any farmers getting to the table and getting them to talk to different groups, local authorities, local citizens. The idea that's come up, this has come up from, again, Nourish Scotland, which is led by farmers, talking to other farming groups. The feeling is that lots of people talk about the role of farmers in delivering climate solutions, but very few people are going out and talking to all the farmers and saying, okay, what do you need to deliver for climate solutions? And have you spoken to people, the citizens in the local area, and what do they need from food? What are their expectations? And what is the role of local authorities? And the idea of these is to go out there and to start these conversations going, not just in the UK. We've got the potential for these dialogues there's dialogues happening in Nigeria, Nicaragua, Ecuador. We spoke to Johannesburg yesterday about them. There's Bangladesh, the possibility of India, China, and we're looking at other countries as well to have these dialogues going ahead over the next year to present and deliver a voice for farmers and citizens to COP, so people can hear what they want. And these dialogues are trying to meet 3 core issues. One is, how can we energize, empower, and align cities and farmers to drive the changes that we all recognize are needed? We know that the cities and farmers, they are really separated from each other. They don't have the chance to talk to each other. Farmers are very, very busy, big or small. They don't often have the opportunity to engage with people all the time. And the issues that worry them are very different from the issues from the people on the ground. And then we also know that a lot of policies, a lot of reports coming from national governments and international bodies, they don't take account of the diversity of farmers, the diversity of farming conditions, the environmental conditions that they're having. And we need to start working out how this can change, how they can be addressed. So while doing this, what we recognize underpinning this work is change happens locally, and that local actors are going to be key in working out, in knowing what can be done and what cannot be done. We really do feel this is the framing for the just transition for food and farming. It's a case of trying to work with the people who are at the brunt of a lot of the impacts and who can drive a lot of the changes to move forward and deliver the solutions that we need. So if you look, there are 3 actions we've highlighted from the dialogues. One is actually getting these dialogues together to build understanding, partnerships, business models, whatever, it could be anything. The other is to start mapping supply chains of cities and what the local area is producing. We're not talking detailed maps, we're talking how many farmers, what's the crops, what are their markets, are they local, are they international, are they regional, what's the environment in that situation, is there a lot of biodiversity, etc. What's the culture in that situation, and what is it, and is the city wanting, what's the challenges you're going to have in your city, your town, your urban area to be able to adapt to a sustainable food system. And then really going into the overall, the context, the wider context of the system and how that needs to be changed. And so we're really trying to pull them together with these different participants so that we can start having a mutual understanding of what works in these areas. And these will lead to the series of local dialogues where they come up with their own solutions, and these dialogues will then feed into an event at COP26 and hopefully beyond, where we can talk about the lessons that have been learnt and hopefully give UN bodies, give national governments, give big NGOs the lessons and the tools and the understanding that they are still missing sometimes. So when they're looking for solutions, they know what they need to do to meet the needs of these other stakeholders. So we think that is a really important way, and it's really key, because we think without the just transition, we're not going to move to a sustainable food and farming system. But in a nutshell, these farm to fork dialogues are going to be 20 local farm city dialogues. They're going to be held globally between now and August 2021, and hopefully we're going to have 100 city and dialogues and people, organizations represented at COP26. And we will bring the farmers and the cities' voices to COP26, because again, we really think we need those voices there to understand the role of change and how we can deliver a just transition. So yeah, and if you want to know more about it, Nourish Scotland has details on their website. Contact me directly as well. We are looking for more partners, we're looking for more countries, and we're really passionate about this being driven by all the participants in webinars like this. We really do think it's you're the ones who are going to make this a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. It's always a pleasure to listen to your presenting, because you put a lot of complicated things into very simple terms for people to understand. So thank you very much. And it's also interesting that some of the stuff you mentioned are connected to the work that Slack and Trust team is doing at the moment with farmers. So I think they'll pick on some of the stuff and get back to you with more information.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'll pass the mic to Happy now. Happy, could we have you? Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. In the bid not to overwhelm people with presentations, I didn't do a presentation. So I will be speaking through some of the dynamics that we are faced with in the process of designing at least a coherent just transition process in South Africa. Just as a side note, I think Dr. Silva would remember, like in response measures, there were quite heavy debates about whether or not land and land as well as energy could be subsumed as one under the just transition. And part of the discussion that I would like to put forward on the table is really largely around how the shift has happened between what the just transition necessitates, as well as what is starting to happen. In previous times, at least here in South Africa, when we thought about the just transition, it was chiefly around energy. Land use, agriculture, food systems weren't necessarily a big concern because they were seen as an opportunity sector, where large amounts of jobs and the potential for growth was identified. But due to the prevailing conditions, not only mechanization, but also the actual impacts of climate change, making that precipitation is not the same as it used to be, the general temperature of the environment where produce is being where food is being produced, and the extent to which refrigeration when transportation is occurring needs to be amped up, meaning that more fuel is used in the value chain, started to make the policymakers to think about whether or not the just transition also should assume larger things and larger sectors than just the energy sector. So the shift actually happened after the discussion around the just transition had occurred, and where more articulated form of the just transition outside of energy had not happened. So it was energy first, everything else was coming as a result of that debate. Now, where we are sitting is that the just transition debate is sitting under a more macro conversation, which is around land reform, with competing interests around food security for one side, because our agricultural landscape is dominated by quite a few large-scale producers. Those large-scale producers produce almost 90% of the foodstuffs that we have in South Africa, with obviously a few margins of imports. And then the residual is done by the small-scale farmers that would be obviously producing for the greater value chain. But food security is the first thing that has been premised in order to make sure that there is adequate food and there's nutrition that is being satisfied for the population. The second consideration is land reform. Due to the history of South Africa and just many countries around the world, and with colonization and the different governing structures that came thereafter, there was a large process of dispossession of land of South African people, particularly the African descents, and those who are of native South African, of this native South African region. Now, there is a process of trying to give people back the land that was dispossessed, at least in the verifiable manner, whilst undertaking a process where you're decarbonizing your food systems. And then the last one, which is quite key in regards to what the just transition is also dealing with, is of course the employment issue. Recently, we're talking about 32% of the entire population in South Africa is unemployed, with some saying 37 to 36%, the unofficial figures, and with a youth population of about 52 to 54% that is unemployed. So there's a great need to have high absorption or labor intensive sectors that would be able to satisfy that need. Now, with that context in mind, where you've got food security, where you've got land reform, and then you've got unemployment, the food systems transition to more of a decarbonized process hasn't been as linear as in many cases, in many areas, primarily to address the climate issue. What we have been found is that even though the just transition is occurring within the auspice of land reform, the necessary skills, the necessary capacity, and the machinery that would enable people to participate fully within the value chain of the food sector has not been able to be put forward, because it wasn't a consideration at first. The belief was that as land reform happens, and as technology development occurs, and as people get access to the market, there will be an eventual capacitation of whoever is participating in that particular value chain. However, that has not been the case. So what is then occurring now is that there's actually been a regress of the land reform process that has obviously translated into political dimensions. But the biggest reform process that is occurring in conjunction with the just transition is that there's a leasing of equipment by the state. The state provides the equipment. Then the person who is participating or is a participant in the particular market then actually leases the property or the actual machinery to the extent to which they can use it. Then they are trained to the extent to which they can be trained, and then they can see as the program goes along. But this does not go to the extent of ownership. Part of that training is, of course, how to actually diversify what you're producing, how to limit your carbon footprint, depending on the particular sector that you are specifically in. If you're in transportation, then of the actual transportation within the food sector, you would then have to play in that particular rule or allocated sphere. And part of the whole deal, at least with us understanding what is going on, is that there is clear constraints and there are clear limitations to which we can push the levers of attaining particular outcomes when we employ the just transition methodologies that have been obviously given to us by the ILO, as well as the labor movement, as well as other organizations like Action Aid, when they came out with the principles, particularly on the food system. The lessons that we're learning is that the political ramifications are quite high, but food security still maintains and still remains a priority of the country beyond just who owns the property or who owns the machinery and who participates in the particular sector. The second lesson that we're learning is that the diversification of those who are participating is quite important because of the political ramifications, but also it introduces new players and opens up industries which weren't previously open to different people, but also diversifies the extent to which those industries would be able to reach different audiences as well as different customers. The co-benefits of the just transition process within the food sector is a third benefit, partly because we are of the mindset and also understanding that the co-benefits are not only in respect to how much jobs are created or the extent of food security, but it's also about the types of skills that are then developed in the process in undertaking the transition. So as you are hearing me explain, is that I'm trying to be very deliberate in using the word just transition, because there has been a transition that has occurred. It was occurring because of the political climate that South Africa is in, similar to the political climate that Namibia is in right now, the same political climate that was prevalent in the times of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, when the property of large farm owners were expropriated without compensation, but also when the actual food system was not attacked, but actually compromised due to the fact that there was a transition of who's the player within that system. So that transition was occurring in any case within the SADC or the Southern African context, as I give you the countries which are Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. But the element of climate change has occurred and has also increased the need for the transitioning to be more just. So not only who owns what, but who can also access it, but whoever owns it, what can they get in the remit of trying to address a historical issue. And I think in closing, the consequences of the food system undergoing a transition also comes to trade issues. The standards and procedures or the guidelines that have been applied in different countries as in respect to the amount of, I guess in this case, the carbon footprint that a particular product has, whether it's food or whether it is a processed agricultural produce, has a bearing on the ability of the domestic country that is producing the particular goods to actually satisfy that. So if there is less demand for that because the country is unable to produce necessary standards, necessary reporting on how much carbon footprint, for example, a pack of oranges has. It has a ramification on the amount of people who are employed in the Western Cape in South Africa who produce a bulk of the citrus foods that is being exported by South Africa. So that dimension also plays quite a big role, and that also spurred on the process of the actual food industry as well as the agricultural industry to become much more open to reporting, to also look at the contents that are being produced as well as the inputs that are being put into the production of the different foodstuffs, including the transportation and the other services that accompany that. So in closing, before I hand over to you, Vositha, I was trying to give you an overview of the different dynamics that are present in the just transition within South Africa with regards to the food system. I've tried to give you a sense of what the likely impacts have been, as well as the considerations that have been taken into account as the process is unveiling. However, I would say that the process is nowhere close to being just, as the small-scale farmers have not been fully incorporated into the design as well as into the propagation of whatever project may be that purports to be just. Over to you, Vositha.
Okay, thank you, Happy. I forgot to mention that Happy wears a few hats. During the negotiations, he negotiates for the government of South Africa and works closely on response measures. So where the comments come from would be based on the interactions during the UNFCCC on response measure negotiation. So I guess you can add a bit more during the conversations we have in the interactive session. Thank you. Now I will pass the mic to Tina for her presentation. Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you for those really informative presentations. So I'm really excited to sort of pivot a little bit here and talk about just transition through an equity and justice lens. So we know that just transition, the vision for it comes from the labor unions and their desire to protect workers and communities affected by transitions away from this damaging industries, in order to ensure a green economy can bring decent jobs and improve the human well-being, as well as address the widening social and economic inequalities. And this has been put in the context of an energy transition and seen as a window of opportunity to improve social, environmental, and economic outcomes for all members of society. But if it's done correctly, what we know is that, excuse me, a just transition can create environmentally and socially sustainable economies and can become a stronger driver for job creation and upgrading of jobs, social justice, and poverty eradication. Many of the speakers today have mentioned that in their talks. And the UNFCCC's guidelines call also for an inclusive transition that reduces inequality and pays particular attention to historically disadvantaged groups, women, youth, indigenous and tribal communities, as well as communities and groups that are in vulnerable situations around the world. So one of the main concerns for a just transition is to ensure that low carbon transitions address social and economic inequality. And what we know are these things, that there is an intersectional effect of economic injustice, climate change, and gender inequality that creates conditions that profoundly affect women, as well as marginalized people's ability to enjoy their fundamental rights and to overcome poverty. As well as most policies assume that justice goals are only achieved by helping those dependent on coal, oil, and gas to move into new roles. But one of the things that I think is overlooked is the fact that a critical reflection on what justice means in the context of energy transition away from fossil fuels, what does that actually mean? So currently there are 3 policy approaches: compensatory policies, adjustment assistance, holistic adaptive support. However, I think, and others think, that the ideal policy approach actually is a holistic, adaptive, supportive policy approach that includes keeping new industries local so workers can retain existing social ties, but also provides for local governments and communities to support for social services, environmental reclamation, and cultural facilities to maintain civic vitality. So not to get rid of, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to really find ways to anchor in the existing communal aspects of societies. But what we also see is that research on historical fossil fuel transition shows that proactive, holistic approaches are very rare. Most policymaking trends to react to transitions are already underway. So this means that there is less of a leaning into this holistic approach, but more of a tendency to go for the compensatory measure to cover losses, rather than that forward-looking adjustment assistant, or how to figure out a different way, a holistic way to address the post-fossil fuel economy. There are equity concerns that need to be considered, of course, and that is what the existing policies focus on when they focus on compensating workers and communities that are directly affected by fossil fuel transitions, rather than on the broader gender and social equality concerns. Many people are left out. So in a Canadian research study that was done, it highlighted that policies focused on fossil fuel workers, for example, are likely to reinforce inequality. So women and migrants are overrepresented in this indirect but supportive roles to the sector. So they can be low-paid service worker or unpaid care worker. And since they tend to underrepresent in this sector, they're probably not going to be covered in the proposed worker compensation and retraining policies. And this is really important in the context of food, because the way in which we are going about dealing with or addressing inequalities in the transition from fossil fuels is pretty much the approach we're taking in other sectors, such as agriculture. So I focus on an equity and justice lens in my work overall, and I really strongly feel that this must be applied from the outset to just transition policy approaches. It has to take into account the role of marginalized people and communities, the work of women that's unpaid care, or as well as their informal work. A just transition must address the intersectional gender, race, and economic implications of energy transition, and ensure that the disenfranchised communities' voices are at the center. Oftentimes the policy initiatives that are put forward before there's any input, before there's any direction or lead by those who are most impacted. And therefore they don't necessarily get the benefit of having policies that reflect their needs, but they find themselves trying to climb up an uphill terrain to address things that usually could have been addressed if we deal with the equity issues from the very beginning. So equity makes good economics. So studies have demonstrated that US $26 trillion, or 26%, could be added to annual global GDP by 2025 if women played an identical role in the labor markets to that of men. If we look at the US, we can see that recent research also indicates that efforts to address the US economy's structural racism would have a huge positive impact on the country. So if the pay gap among racial groups were eliminated, for example, in the US would be 14% more richer, would be 14% richer. So this approach, addressing structural sexism and structural racism, can have a huge economic benefit for society. So it should make us wonder if we could address all of the injustices in our society, that there probably is a better, deeper economic impact that we are missing out on because we are not looking at the equity aspects of the approaches for policy currently that could be transformative for communities across the globe. So what's the problem? Well, structural gender, economic inequalities, and environmental injustice are compounded by the disproportionate impact that climate change has on women's rights and the rights of marginalized people, communities based on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic class. This is not new. So the problem is not a new problem, but I want to just state what the problem is. And these intersectional effects of economic injustice, environmental injustice, climate change, and gender inequality create these conditions that profoundly affect women and marginalized people's ability to enjoy the fundamental rights and overcome poverty. I'm saying that again because I think that's really a crux of equity and justice through a just transition lens, that these solutions should be about the fundamental rights to overcome poverty, and not that folks are put deeper in poverty. I want to transition from equity and from just talking about equity and justice in a sort of a broad way, but to focus it in on women in agriculture and what just transition means. So for women across Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia, they make up 43% of the agricultural labor force. In sub-Saharan Africa, they account for about 50% of the farming population. But due to patriarchal and cultural norms, women are usually expected to be responsible for caring for children and elderly family members, as well as feeding the family. And in rural areas, girls and women are responsible for fetching water and firewood. And this unpaid care work often holds them back from productive activities. And that includes their livelihood of farming effectively, and then also leaves them exhausted and really little time for just being a person, for leisure or just for rest. The cultural pressures or low literacy and confidence often discourage women from participating actively in community planning processes, and therefore their voices are not part of the discussion nor their perspectives in local decision-making, which is really impactful for what happens to them when they're not there. The educational or cultural barriers, fear of violence, and lack of infrastructure also mean that women are unable to sell their products in local markets and are at greater risk of being exploited. The other piece of this is policies. Policies oftentimes add additional barriers. Even though women do account for more than half of farmers in many countries, it's often assumed that men are the default farmer. And therefore they don't get the same access to the things that men get because they're not part of the equation when these decisions are being made. So this also discourages women's land tenure or access to finance to reduce their ability to make investments for more effective farming and adaptation. In many countries, extension services ignore women altogether, and agroecological farming techniques. And then the provided support is often given to men to grow cash crops and not to women. But if women were to have the same access to productive resources as men, they could lift 100 to 150 million people out of hunger. So what do we do to ensure equity and justice and a just transition? This is the hard work, and this is actually what leads to equity and justice outcomes that benefits everyone in society. We've heard about the role of government, and of course government has a role here to develop long-term energy transition strategies that align with both agreed climate goals and commitments to improving social equity. Transition planning also should take into account both distributive and procedural justice and consider those who will be affected throughout the whole energy system, food system. The planning process should be seen as an opportunity to remedy existing injustices in the energy system and the food system. I use energy system here as a framework, again, because this is a good example of how we are going about doing the work of just transition through research that's done in this space. It can be applied to agriculture and other gender issues if we were to do that. But I have a note of caution. Sometimes, as we know, governments do not have the capacity or willingness to undertake meaningful transition planning. Even though the research might be there, the will to implement may not. So civil society has a role, and so does business, and they have the opportunity to lead. The grassroots effort to take on transition initiatives are developing across the globe, and communities are taking innovative action to democratize and decarbonize their energy systems. So a just transition is likely to be found in these more diverse and diffused local efforts. But what they do is provide both a vision and example of what a more equitable and just future will look like. And they can lay the political groundwork for higher levels of government to engage and implement. It's really important to note that, you know, we as civil society folks can and will do our best to ensure that we have equity and justice, and having the role of government be fulfilled in such a way that it also meets the needs and demands of us as a global community to address these inequities, that we actually can do a lot to ensure that we move towards a just transition that is rooted in equity and justice, and looking at the needs of women, of folks that are marginalized throughout this, our world societies, but that it's a collective push, that we will not get there solely by wishing it, meeting it, talking about it, but really collectively coming together to ensure that we are moving towards a more just and fair society from the outset. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Tina. It was very, what would I say, like motivating me to think a lot of things, connecting with the work that we do, with the concepts that you presented, and actually examples of things that you mentioned as well. And Tina was very, or is rather, I'm not entirely sure whether you're still part of CAN, but she was working on Climate Action Network for a while, working with communities and civil society organizations to get justice and equity related to climate action. So maybe she could answer more questions on this front when she's answering your questions. So basically, next questions and answer session now. I have a few questions, but I will request those who have questions for our speakers to type in the question to the chat box that we have, and I will read it out, or we can maybe project it, or they can read it on the chat box as well. So first question, I'll keep it as an open one. So a few things that I noticed was there's a component of social justice, there's a component of social protection we discussed, and then there's policy and there's local action, then things that are planned ahead, like I hope I got this term right, folk to farm, or this farm to folk, I think it's folk to farm, that Duncan mentioned. It's farm to folk, sorry, yes. I was wondering whether I wrote it correct. Yes. So in these processes that are planned ahead, whether we can potentially address some of the gaps that were highlighted, or whether bring some of the things that we discussed today. So the first question is, we speak about social protection, we speak about employment, and we speak about gender. We also have risk transfer mechanisms that we talk about when we're talking of response measures and economic diversification. So in the work that you do you have examples that can relate to risk transfer, which is linked to just transition, or potentially examples of success stories related to gender and linking up with just transition? Maybe we could replicate them in the work that we're doing. And for Vintura, maybe you could answer the question on how this links to the policy front and the UNFCCC. It's an open question. Anyone who wants to, yeah.
I could give it a go first. So from UNFCCC side, I think there is a great opportunity in terms of policy and decision making. We are now going through a process of updating or revising the nationally determined contributions towards Paris Agreement, which forms the building blocks of how the countries are going to forward towards the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And if you look at the ICTU guidance, which actually came from Katowice as well, which defines how to structure your nationally determined contributions. For traceability, it talks about addressing response measures. And we see some of the countries here that I work with in the Caribbean who had considered just transition measures from the NDC activities already in the planning process. So while they're defining their NDCs, they're also considering how the just transition is taken into consideration. For example, for Antigua and Barbuda, we have a renewable energy in the NDC. They're going for renewable energy technologies, and they want to see about the reskilling of the people that's needed in order to meet the requirements of this transition, and how those in the traditional fossil fuel-based economy could be impacted, and how to take care of that. And in Grenada, we have an example of they're considering just transition, especially addressing the needs of women, how women are going to be impacted through these nationally determined contribution policies that they're putting in place, and how to ensure that there is just transition of the labor force, that the female labor force, with regard to this implementation of those policies. So it's important, not just actually at the NDC level, as I mentioned in my presentation, also to ensure that all the other integrated policies are addressed sufficiently within this transition. Back to you.
Thank you, Vintura. Who would like to take the floor next? Okay, Tina, Duncan, would you like to add anything? Or? No, okay. Happy, would you like to say anything? If you're still there, because I can't see you.
Sorry about that. My internet all the way down in the south of Africa is really bad. Yeah, so the work that we've been working on, or rather the pieces of work that we've been working on that leads directly to social flaws, is one obviously that is around the world, has been quite big since COVID-19, which is the Universal Basic Income Grant. The basis being that as just generally within society, by any measure, there's an amount of wealth that is created at a basic level and should be shared across every person and every civilian in society. So we've been pushing for the extension of the COVID-19 grant. The idea being that because there's already been a precedent that's been set around there being just a basic income grant for all citizens within the country, you can then further extend that into specific areas where, for example, there is high vulnerability of job displacement, for example, in the coal sector or in the agricultural sector due to the variability of weather patterns and precipitation, as I included earlier. So there's a degree of risk and attribution that needs to be undertaken in order to determine exactly what that amount is, because it has to be specific to the sector and the extent to which one is participating in that sector. Looking at the gender dynamics, as Tina has mentioned, we have not necessarily looked at the extent to which this would cover different gender groups, but the appreciation is that at this current moment in time, most of the workforce is male. So outside of the Universal Basic Income Grant, what would happen is that the actual leverage or the variance above what is the base floor of the universal income grant would unfortunately be within the remit of the people who are the majority of the ones who are employed, which does present a different consideration altogether, which we hadn't looked at within the gender aspect actually in this context. But in the just transition social flaws, the first one is the universal income grant. The second one is retraining and reskilling with the auxiliary services or sectors that are present within the local community and territory, trying to make sure that there isn't community displacement due to people trying to migrate for jobs and losing the sense of belonging that is attached to one's identity by where they live. Outside of that, of course, it's just generally the current retraining process that is happening within the coal and within the agricultural sector. Over.
Thank you, Happy. So there's a question, there's a few. I will ask the first one to Tina and Duncan, if you would like to take this. Um, so the question is whether you could expand a bit more on how we can best address the needs of the many informal or unregistered workers, especially in developing countries, when it comes to just transition. Would that be a question you'd like to take, or would you like to pass it to someone else? Tina and Duncan, is this something for you?
I don't do this I don't have this particular focus on, so I would pass on this and just only add after I hear from other experts on the call. I don't want to take up the space if someone else has a really good answer or response.
Duncan, is this a question for you, or is it something for Vintura?
I'd say it's something. I'm with Tina on this, I'm afraid. Yes.
Okay, Vintura, happy? Would you like to take it?
Vositha, could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, it's a request to expand on how we can best address the needs of the many informal or unregistered workers, especially in developing countries when it comes to just transition.
Okay, I mean, I won't say I would be a specialist on this because this is more work that would be handled by ILO. And as far as I know, the normal work that we do is actually on the mapping of this work, the workers who will be impacted through various measures that have been put in place, whether it is climate change related or addressing COVID with the pandemic, who and how they will be impacted. As you know, the informal sector was largely impacted from the COVID shutdowns. And it's important to really understand the nature of impact and the level of impact of these sectors. And then, of course, when addressing on the recovery, whether it's to austerity packages or any government actions, need to be providing sufficient information. I, of course, don't have in-depth knowledge, again, on this topic, on the numbers impacted and how, but this is the normal approach that we do in terms of approach that we would take in case of any sector for that matter, not just for the specific marginalized sectors that was mentioned.
Thank you. Yes,
yeah, I would just add, just add to this is I think that the opportunity for research in this sector is huge, because with COVID, what we have seen is that in the sectors that we identify and we can see the numbers, the number is huge. 100 million people unemployed in certain countries, and that number going up. Duncan's example of 1 million plus more young kids in England or the UK who are going hungry. These are numbers that are quantifiable because we can actually see them, we can actually touch them. But the informal work, the work that is not, the work that we don't see is really an area of research that we need to look into, because this is going to be a really big contributing factor to what makes a just transition equitable, what makes it fair. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think there's not a lot of scholarship out there on this, and I think that also makes it really difficult. So there's an opportunity here for that.
Okay, unless anyone else doesn't want to add on this topic, I'll pass to the next question. So it's a question to Happy plus others. So the question is, when addressing the transitioning sectors in the overarching conversation of just transition, do you see this changing in the years to come by incorporating more sectors in wanting to make the decision more inclusive? So do you see this expanding more? If I'm going to add a bit more. If yes, what would be the sectors? And we're talking about agriculture and food sector. How can this be more structured, maybe? Just to give a few parts to the answer.
Cool. I'll start. No, thanks for the question. It's a good question. The first answer is there's a political answer that would say yes. There is a slow, gradual incorporation of the different sectors into the conversation of just transition, because now it's not looked at a sectoral level, it's economy-wide. It's not just about energy, it's not just about transport, it's about the different facets that make up our economy, right? And then how much, and at least if it's the climate concern, how much carbon content is being produced from each and every one of those. The real answer, which is more pragmatic, the answer is most likely no. You could have, at least in many countries, at least in the developing ones, where you have a number of high impact sectors that would be vulnerable if they do not transition, and then you actually work on a just transition plan for those, and then that is the basic framework for your just transition plan. In other countries, let's say in more forested or countries with a lot of sinking capability, carbon sequestration capability, it would be in the forestation. In countries like South Africa with a high coal content, it would be the energy sector. In countries where it is quite easily one of the major water economies, let's say in Africa, like the DRC or Zambia or Zimbabwe, you then have a different context to which you would be looking at the just transition. So the political answer is yes, almost everything comes in because it's the economy, but in the real sense, it's really about where the highest vulnerability is and where exposure is felt the most, and then the low hanging fruits are the ones that would be employed in order to effect the just transition. Over.
Okay, thank you, Happy. Anyone else who would like to add? If not, I can take the last question because we're also running out of time. Question to any speaker says, especially developing countries will need financial support to facilitate a just transition across many sectors. Are there any innovative financial instruments that you could be specifically linked? Oh, I mean, if you could give examples of innovative financial instruments, is the question. So where does the finance come for just transition, in other terms? Anyone who would like to take it? Happy you're on the spot, but we could wait for the others to see whether Vintura or Tina or Duncan would like to take it. Maybe even in your examples, yes.
Maybe I can give it a go. Specifically in the food sector, I'm not aware, and not in developing countries, but in developed countries, and in countries such as Poland, there are certain funds that are created by the government that support just transition, not in this agriculture sector per se, but more in line with like the coal sector just transition for the workers that are impacted. So there is more policy level work. And I know in South Africa with the coal as well, there were some studies that were done initially, but I don't know if there was any funding that was developed as a result of these initial studies on how to manage the impacted workers from the transition that was planned in their climate policy. This again is right now happening more at national levels. I don't know of any international funds that are available. There is of course technical support that are being provided to countries with ILO and several other organizations who are working on understanding the impact. As we discussed previously, there's a lot more needed to be done on the specific sectors that are going to be impacted, like the informal sector. We really do not have these numbers in the national statistics. So there's more in-depth studies that need to be done. And the funding, there's no specific funding right now that I know of that is internationally available, but sector-wise, there are funds that are mobilized through some of the multinational development banks. Right now, it's more focusing on, of course, the energy sector, which from the climate change perspective is a key sector that would need to be addressed if we are to move for a greener economy. But I believe in the food sector, there is currently not much work except some of the projects that are supported under the Adaptation Fund, for example, that do support some of the initiatives, but not necessarily addressing just the just transition component, but it's linked with the whole adaptation measure that includes just transition as part of addressing the measure. Back to you.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else who would like to add on to what Vintura said? Or else it could be an open question. You mentioned a lot of activities related to just transition. So we might not want to look into the term of just transition in itself to raise funds, but the work that you mentioned that could happen to achieve just transition. Where would this funding be from? I personally can think of maybe even a GCF project having a component of just transition in it. I'll leave it to you if you want to suggest anything further on this, or we can go to the closing remarks because we are also running out of time.
Go ahead, Duncan. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tina. Just I'll be very quick. No, we are actually mapping this as we speak around what sort of financial support there is for the just transition around food and agriculture, and we're finding there's very, very little from national governments, very little from international bodies. We've had conversations with some of the big trusts and foundations like the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, the Oak Foundation, Rockefeller. They're aware of it. They haven't got programs in place to support it yet, but it's something they're looking at, recognizing that it's a key. There is a big funding gap here, and it's key to delivering a lot of the goals that they've put in place. So yeah, we're hopeful things will happen, but it's still very thin on the ground. Over to you, Tina.
I was going to say something similar, that one of the issues around food in particular is that the research is not really there on how we would answer these things, but there is potential. The GCF is one. There are some other programs that could potentially come out of the I always get it, the International Monetary Fund. I mean, but these could be things that can be fostered by research analysis, and then the question, where do we start funding this very important part of human existence, food, and how do we start addressing this? So this conversation today is a really helpful start to be thinking about that.
Happy, would you like to add anything?
I was going to say exactly what Duncan and Tina said. Yeah, there isn't much funding, to be honest, for just transition within the context of food systems. There is funding for traditional means of production in food systems. There's money there. You'll get all the subsidies that you need. But to shift, there isn't yet. Yeah, so just reiterate and just say ditto to what has been said.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm wondering, given that we are moving towards NDC review processes and then also NAP readiness funding, and even SDG targets, localized targets that are being developed in a lot of countries, whether these are opportunities for us to engage and include just transition elements into it, because these are not new things. Most of them are components of even SDGs, right? Gender component, then employment, financial instruments to facilitate all these sustainable aspects, resilience. So maybe we could think of entry points where countries could do their own activities, connecting with what's already there to ensure that just transition in the food sector could be ensured. So thank you, everyone. It was lovely talking to all of you, a lot of things learned, and wish we had more time, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So I'll close it from my side. If you want to add anything else, please, you have 30 seconds, closing remarks, and then I'll say bye once you're done.
This is Tina. I would just say that there's a really wonderful opportunity coming up with the implementation of the Paris Agreement with the new NDCs, where we could actually be doing things at the country level to make sure just transition has a real clear path forward from the countryside. So there is some opportunity there for looking at it in the context of the UNFCCC, and then work on the ground, of course, is always essential. And thanks for having me.
I want to thank Vositha for organizing this event, and all the other panelists as well as the audience. Thank you.
Okay, I can jump in now. Thanks. Yeah, again, thank you for the opportunity and for learning from the different speakers. And it's nice to see you again, all individually. And again, just as Tina said as well, the local context really does matter a lot. As much as we're working at a national level, we should be working within the actual places that we live. to make sure that the things that we want to see are there, and the just transition is one, so we should keep fighting for it. The more we say it, the more likely and the more it will come out of the different programs and processes that the government is designing, because they have to design things in any case. So let's rather put the right things in the right places. And lastly is hope everybody's safe.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that. So I hope everyone's safe as well. Happy, good sentiments. And I mean, it's been great to be on this panel with everyone. I have learned so much. It's been fascinating. I've scribbled a whole couple of pages of notes, so thank you for that. And yeah, I really agree with everything. I think 2021 is a really unique opportunity for us to really be positive and get just transition on the map, on the global stage. Keep mentioning it, get people thinking about it while delivering local action. I think there's a positive future ahead of us if we can really get the momentum going next year, and I'm sure we can. So and everyone be well going forward.
Thank you, Duncan, and everyone else. Big thank you for all of the people who joined us, asked questions, and we'll meet everyone tomorrow with 2 more panel discussions. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.